Hi everyone. We are starting chapter 4 in the Pierce text, which is all about how sex is determined in individual species and some of the characteristics or traits that are linked to the sex chromosomes. So just keep in mind for the remaining of the chapter, we're really going to be focusing on both the X and the Y chromosome, and shown on this slide here, actually um, microscopic digital photos of the X and the Y chromosome. So we can see that there's a whole lot more genetic material actually associated with the X chromosomes compared to the Y. But both of them encompass a lot of very important genes for the determination of a sex in a species. All right, so chapter 4 is packed with a lot of different things. So this is just kind of an outline of how we're going to move through this chapter. So first of all, we're going to talk about sex determination, then we'll talk about sex-linked characteristics, and finally we'll end with dosage compensation. All right, so the story that the book starts out with is actually really pretty interesting. So it starts talking about bearded dragons, and so this bearded dragon that they've studied pretty intensely is actually occurs in Central Australia. And the unique part about this bearded dragon is that sex is determined in this species by two major factors. So, both the chromosomes that the individual possesses and the temperature in which the egg was actually incubated. So, this is a chromosomal by environmental sex determination system. In the males actually can have two genotypes for the male sex. The first one is ZZ, and the male only is going to have one chromosome genotype for sex, so it's going to be a homozygous ZZ. And these males are going to phenotypically be male if they were actually incubated at 32 degrees Celsius or less. Females, on the other hand, can have one of two genotypes. They can actually be homozygous ZZ or they can be ZW. The ZZ genotype in the females, the female will actually be genetically male, but will have phenotypic male or female characteristics, and that is the reason for that is because those eggs were actually incubated at 36 degrees Celsius or higher. So this is just one example that we're going to talk about in this chapter. So first of all, we're going to start with sex determination. So sex is going to be determined in most species by the X and the Y chromosome. So if we think about humans, the male species has a 50% chance of passing on either an X or a Y chromosome, whereas the female or the egg is always going to contribute an X chromosome. So this really links back to the type of sex determination system called XXXY. So just keep in mind that the male is actually going to be the individual that determines the sex of the offspring, because the female can only pass on an X chromosome. The male has the ability to pass on either an X or a Y chromosome. So when it comes to reproduction, keep in mind that this is going to take us back to the meiosis. So the meiotic process is going to produce haploid gametes, and then those gametes are going to go through fertilization, where they're going to actually fuse a second pair of chromosomal material in, and that second pair is going to produce, or the second pair of chromosomes or fertilization is going to produce a diploid zygote. So just keep this figure in mind as we start to talk about the different types of sexual determination. So the first we're going to talk about is, or just to give you guys a little bit of a basis, we'll come back to humans here in just a little bit as well, but the parent generation is going to be determining the F1 generation, the sex of the F1 generation. And like we said a couple of slides ago, our males are really the ones that are going to determine the sex of the next generation because they're going to either pass on an X chromosome or a Y chromosome, whereas the female can only pass on an X. So in that F1 generation, we get a 50-50 ratio of male to female. So we have the male contribution is either going to give us an X or a Y, but the female contribution is always going to give us an X. Okay, so that's why we get a 1-to-1 sex ratio, or 50% female, 50% male sex ratio with most animal and plant and most animal species. So this chapter is really kind of outlining how sex is determined in different species, but we're also going to talk about conditions that occur when things get messed up or we get some sort of miscommunication going on. So there is a couple of these occasions that male and female parts will actually develop. So one of those is hermaphrodism, and this is where an individual will actually possess both male and female parts. A second second deformation is where both the male and the female parts actually occur in one organism. So that is what we call monoecious. And so that means that there is only one house or one individual organism that possesses both male and female parts. And then the opposite of that is where that individual only has either male or female parts, but not both. And so that's called dioecious. And that's where we actually see two houses that have to come together to produce offspring. All right, so let's just make sure that we've got a good handle on the sex chromosomes versus our autosomes. Okay, so as we look at a karyotype of a baby, so a human individual, you can see that we've got 22 pairs of autosomes. Here's number 1 up here, and here's number 22 down here. So 22 pairs of autosomes, and then we've got 1 pair of sex chromosomes. And we know that this individual is a male because he's got 1 Y chromosome and 1 X chromosome. So as we start to talk about different mechanisms of sex determination, I just want to make sure that you guys are kind of following along with the book as well. So first of all, we're going to talk about chromosomal determination. And within chromosomal determination, we really have 4 different mechanisms that we're going to talk about. All right, so the first one that we're going to talk about is called XXXO, and an example of this is where we see it actually occurring in grasshoppers. So female grasshoppers will be the homogametic sex, meaning that they have the same sex chromosome. So females will have 2 X chromosomes, and then the males, they will be the heterogametic sex, and in this case, the male actually only possesses 1 X chromosome, and that's it. So the O actually means that there's no chromosome present. Okay, so males have half of the gametic material that a female does. So that really is what determines sex determination in the XXXO example. A second example is in humans, and this is what we call the XXXY sex determination system. In this case, the female is also homogametic, meaning that they have 2 X chromosomes, so they have the same sex chromosome. The male is heterogametic, meaning that they have different sex chromosomes. So the males are going to have an X and a Y chromosome. Okay, so the X chromosome is going to carry the same genes, but these genes tend to act like autosomal genes. Okay, so just keep this in mind as you're thinking about the parent generation contributing certain chromosomes to the F1 generation. And then also realize that when sex chromosomes actually line up and find their pair in meiosis, they are actually going to only be um, homogametic and have the same type of genetic material in the telomere region. So the red portion of the chromosomes up here. So that means that the um, gametic information at the telomere on the X chromosome and the Y chromosome are actually going to be the same. So the X and the Y chromosome are going to be homologous at these pseudo-autosomal regions, and this is really going to be essential for the pairing up activity that happens in meiosis in the male. Okay, so keep in mind our males are going to have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. Therefore, they do not have an even distribution of genetic material to go through meiosis. So males are very much dependent on these pseudo-autosomal regions for the chromosomes to actually line up the way that they're supposed to. A third example of chromosomal sex determination is ZZ-ZW, and we see a lot of avian species, reptiles, and butterflies have this type of sex determination. Keep in mind that this is just a different type of chromosomal determination. The chromosomes don't actually look like Z's. Okay, so the big switch here compared to the human species is that the female becomes a heterogametic sex, meaning that they have different sex chromosomes, and the male ends up being the homogametic sex. So in this case, males are ZZ and females are ZW. All right, and there's one more type of sex determination that I want to talk about, but this is not discussed in the book, but this is very important to agriculture. And this is called haploid diploidy. And so bees, specifically honeybees, are going to have this type of sex determination. So sex is going to be based on the number of chromosome sets found in the nucleus of each cell. So if males have males are only going to have one copy of genetic material, and females are going to have two copies of genetic material. So our queen bees or our females are going to be diploid in nature, whereas the males or the worker bees are going to be haploid. So this type of sex determination system really results in some different and some alternate percentages of common genes from moving from the parent generation to the F1 generation. So, for example, we've got our female, or our queen bee up here. When her genetic material goes through meiosis, she is going to be contributing at least one copy of her genetic material to the F1 generation. If no fertilization takes place, then that individual in the F1 generation remains male because there's only one copy of genetic information. However, if the female passes on her copy of genetic information and the male ends up contributing sperm as well during the fertilization process, then there's two sources of genetic information coming together, resulting in a diploid zygote. Therefore, the product of that offspring will be female. So just some fun facts if you guys are interested in bees and bee production. Females are going to get 50% of their genetic material from their mother and 100% of the genetic material from their father. The bees that are going to be full sisters to each other are actually only 75% related, and full brothers are only half related or 50% related. So think through that a little bit. The more we've done a lot of research with bee families, and researchers have found that the more related and the more common the genes are amongst families, the more cooperation the bees have. So you'll actually see very distinct flying patterns and dispersal patterns among families of bees that have similar genetic material.